The Atlantic slave trade or transatlantic slave trade took place across the Atlantic Ocean from the 15th through to the 19th centuries. It involved European countries coming to Africa and enslaving Africans to send them to the Americas and Europe as hard labor to work on their plantations, etc. The slave trade and transporting of a lot of young, abled Africans to the Americas limited the chance of the African continent to be able to cultivate land and develop. Majority of the enslaved who were transported to the Americas came from West Africa. Many scholars say this is what has led Africa to be undeveloped till this day. We often look at Europe, Portugal, Britain, France as the face of the slave trade. And yes, they were major players, but they couldn't have succeeded without the aid of some African kingdoms. Yes, African rulers and elites helped and were the reason why the trade was possible. These kingdoms had a culture which were very keen on their military and embarked on constant warfare to capture and provide the number of human captives that the Europeans needed from them in the trade. This is not a story of blame, but is a story of truth, and the truth they say is bitter. A disturbing, uncomfortable truth that we must face not to repeat the same mistakes again and evolve. In this video, we are going to talk about all the African kingdoms and tribes who were involved in the slave trade. You see, slavery wasn't new to Africa. Long before the first European ship touched our shores, slavery existed on the continent, but it looked very different from the nightmare that it turned into. In many African societies, slavery meant debt bondage. A man might sell himself or his child into servitude to repay what he owed. It could mean being a war captive, taken prisoner after battle, forced to serve the victorious kingdom, or it could mean criminal punishment, where a thief or murderer would be enslaved instead of executed. And even within those systems, there was still a glimmer of humanity. Slaves could often marry, they could have families, and they could sometimes even own property. In some kingdoms, they could even rise to positions of influence or power, and their children were not automatically born into slavery. It was harsh, it was exploitation, but it was not chattel slavery. Everything changed when the Europeans arrived. They came not as traders of goods, but as traffickers of flesh, with their ships, their guns, and their insatiable greed. They demanded not temporary service, not war captives, not debtors, but demanded people as property, men, women, and children reduced to cargo, branded, bought, and sold like livestock, not just for their lifetime, but for every generation after them. This was slavery stripped of all humanity. And as the system grew, some African rulers and kingdoms, seeing profit, guns, and power, chose to feed the machine. What began as a trade of captives slowly became a continent-wide business of betrayal, and the kingdoms and tribes who were involved are as follows. 1. The kingdom of Dahomey was not just another African state, it was a war machine, a militaristic empire rising in the 1600s and 1700s in the region we know today as Benin. Under King Agaja in the early 1700s, Dahomey became a major power. King Agaja's armies marched with discipline, iron will, and ruthless force. They conquered Alada and Waida, two cities that weren't just towns, but major slave ports on the Atlantic coast. From these ports, tens of thousands of African men, women, and children were loaded onto European ships, never to return home. Dahomey's military campaigns were brutal. Soldiers stormed neighboring villages at night, burned homes, massacred resistors, and captured survivors. These captives became the currency of the kingdom. They were sold to European traders in exchange for the tools of power, guns, rum, and cloth. By the 1800s, under King Gezo, Dahomey had perfected this system. Gezo himself declared, "The slave trade is the ruling principle of my people. It is the source and the glory of their wealth." This wasn't just trade. For Dahomey, slavery was an institution, a business, a way of life. Even their famed female warriors, the Agoji, sometimes called the Dahomey Amazons, fought in raids to capture slaves. Their bravery was celebrated, but their victories meant more bodies in chains. To Dahome's kings, every war was an opportunity, every raid was profit, and every captive was wealth. 2. The Ashanti Empire in what is today Ghana was one of the most powerful and wealthy states in West Africa. They were rich in gold, so rich in fact that Europeans called the region the Gold Coast. But it wasn't just gold that fueled Ashanti power, it was slavery also. The Ashanti built their empire on military conquest. Their armies marched across the Gold Coast, crushing rival tribes and kingdoms. Every war ended with captives, men, women, and children, chained and forced into slavery. Some became domestic slaves, serving Ashanti nobles, building their palaces and working their fields. But thousands more were sold. The captives were branded, burned with marks of ownership, and forced on long, brutal marches through forests and dirt paths. Many collapsed, some died. Those who survived were dragged to the coastal fortresses of Cape Coast Castle and Elmina Castle. Inside these dungeons, in the suffocating dark, they waited until British traders bought them, packed them into ships, and sent them across the Atlantic. For the Ashanti, this was business. For the captives, it was the end of freedom, the beginning of a nightmare from which most would never return. 3. To the east, the Oyo Empire of the Yoruba people in present-day Nigeria rose as another giant in the slave trade. The Oyo mastered the art of war on horseback. Their powerful cavalry thundered across the savannas, raiding villages deep in the interior, far from the coast. Every raid ended the same: smoke, fire, and captives. These prisoners torn from their homes were driven in chains toward the coast. Through Badagry and Lagos, Oyo's captives were sold to European traders. From there, they were shipped into the nightmare of the Atlantic. The empire's leaders grew rich on this trade. The British hunger for human cargo filled Oyo's coffers with weapons, luxury goods, and influence. At their peak, Oyo's power was unmatched, so great that even the kingdom of Dahomey, fierce and militaristic as it was, had to bow down, paying tribute to Oyo. For a time, Oyo stood as a titan of war and commerce, its strength built not only on gold or land, but on the endless traffic of human lives. The Aero Confederacy of present-day Nigeria was unlike the great empires of Oyo, Ashanti, or Dahomey. It was not a kingdom ruled by one throne, but a vast network of powerful Igbo merchants, priests, and warriors that stretched across southeastern Nigeria. What gave the Arrow their power was not just armies, but belief. They controlled the oracles, the most famous being the Ibini Ukpabi, also called the Long Juju oracle. Through religion, they commanded fear and obedience. Those condemned by the oracle often met a grim fate. Sold into slavery, their sentence justified as divine judgment. From 1690 to 1902, the Aro Confederacy became one of the largest suppliers of slaves in all of West Africa. They acted as middlemen, linking the deep interior to the European forts on the coast. Men, women, and children passed through Aro trade routes, funneled toward the Bight of Biafra. From there, ships carried them across the Atlantic, many to the Caribbean and the southern United States. Historians estimate that the Aro were responsible for selling over 850,000 people. For 2 centuries, the Aro's grip was unshakable. Their wealth, their influence, their very power was built on the backs of those they betrayed into slavery. 5. Kingdom of Alada. Before the rise of Dahomey, the Kingdom of Alada was already a major player in the slave trade. Its position on the coast made it a prime port for European ships, especially the Portuguese and French. Alada's soldiers raided inland villages, capturing men, women, and children. These captives were marched to the coast, where they were exchanged for guns, liquor, and foreign goods. Through this trade, Alada grew rich, its rulers wielding power built on the traffic of human lives. But in 1724, Alada's fortunes changed when the militaristic kingdom of Dahomey turned its armies against them. Alada was conquered and its capital burned. The irony was brutal. The kingdom that once thrived by selling others into slavery now saw its own people enslaved and sold. 6. In the tangled waterways of the Niger Delta, 2 kingdoms, Boni and Kalabari, rose as powerful middlemen of the slave trade. They did not always raid for captives themselves. Instead, they became the crucial link between inland kingdoms and the Europeans waiting on the coast. Caravans of chained captives poured into their ports, where the trade never ceased. Of the two, Borni became one of the busiest slave ports in all of West Africa. Thousands upon thousands passed through its shores, bound for ships that would carry them across the Atlantic. The exchange was always the same: human lives traded for guns, gin, and European cloth. The kings of Boni and Calabari grew rich and powerful from this exchange, but the cost was immeasurable. Behind their wealth lay a sea of suffering, entire generations stolen, and countless souls shipped away into eternal darkness. 7. In the northwest corner of Africa, across Senegal, the Gambia, and Mali, the kingdoms of the Mandinka, Wolof, and Fula also became deeply entangled in the trade. Here, warfare and religious jihads tore communities apart. Victorious armies seized captives by the thousands, feeding the insatiable European demand for human lives. Along the coast, the trade grew into a system. Places like Gorée Island and St. Louis became major hubs where African leaders and European traders struck their bargains. The exchange was relentless. Captives were marched from the interior to the coast, crammed into holding cells, and then loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. For the rulers and merchants of Senegambia, the slave trade brought wealth and foreign goods, but for the people torn from their homes, it brought only chains, loss, and death. From the forests of Mali to the coast of Gorée, the story was the same: a region bled dry by war, betrayal, and the selling of its own people. 8. In the northeast, the Kanem Bornu Empire, centered in today's Borno state, was another supplier in the slave trade. For centuries, Bornu kings waged wars and conducted raids, capturing thousands. Islamic influence also shaped the trade. Jihads and rivalries turned prisoners of war into slaves. Many captives were marched across the Sahara in trans-Saharan caravans, sold into North Africa and the Middle East, but others were funneled south, feeding into the Atlantic trade through Hausa and Fulani networks. Bornu's power, like so many others, was built on the same cruel foundation: the selling of its own people into slavery. 9. Kong Empire. Further west, in what is now Ivory Coast, rose the Kong Empire, a wealthy Islamic state built on trade. At first, Kong thrived on gold and kola nuts, connecting the forests of West Africa to the great Saharan trade routes. But as European demand for slaves grew, Kong became part of that system too. Warfare, jihads, and raids supplied captives who were sold to traders and marched toward the coast. From there, they were funneled through neighboring ports in present-day Ghana and Ivory Coast and shipped across the Atlantic. Kong's mosques and markets were built on commerce, but behind that prosperity was the same story repeated across Africa: human lives turned into profit. The kingdom of Kwoja or Koya, also known as Koya Temne, along the coast of Sierra Leone, the kingdom of Koya, also called the Temne Kingdom, rose as a powerful state in the 1500s. It controlled the rivers and trade routes, making it a natural partner for European merchants. Koya rulers struck deals with the Portuguese, Dutch, and later the British, exchanging captives for muskets, textiles, and liquor. Their warriors raided neighboring peoples, feeding the demand of slave ships anchored just off the coast. By the 1700s, Korea had become one of the most influential kingdoms in the region. Its leaders grew wealthy and powerful, but their strength came at a price. Thousands of their own neighbors and rivals were shipped into the horrors of the Middle Passage. We cannot rewrite history. Yes, Europe industrialized the trade. Yes, they built the ships and created the markets in the Americas. But without the supply from African kingdoms, this scale of human trafficking wouldn't have been possible. Let's be clear: millions were kidnapped, brutalized, and killed. Entire societies collapsed. Generations were lost, and Africa, once a thriving continent of kingdoms and empires, was left broken. And yet, we rarely talk about the African side of this trade. Why? Because it's uncomfortable. Because it forces us to ask hard questions about greed, power, and complicity. And yet, this same greed, power, and complicity still continue to exist today on the African continent through our presidents and politicians. History is not about shame, it's about truth. And if we truly want to understand the legacy of slavery, we must understand all parts of it, including the African kingdoms who helped make it happen. This is not about blaming modern Africans. Africans who did these acts are not alive today. But if we can face this dark chapter fully, honestly, we can learn from it, we can teach it, and we can make sure it never happens again. If you found this video powerful, share it. Let the truth be known.